All right, so there was a little bit of a tidbit around full self-driving that was in the earnings call yesterday for Tesla that I didn't hear many people talking about, and I think it was actually very interesting. So I wanted to take a quick look at what was actually said, what Tesla has put in the 10Q, and then a very kind of quick, rough back of the envelope math on what it might imply for FSD take rate going forward. So let's take a look at what was actually said in the call. So I'm just going to read this rather than sharing my screens. I've got a couple different share screens going on, and we're going low production value right now. But it says, we released FSD for Cybertruck and other features like actually Smart Summon, like Elon talked about, in North America, which contributed 326 million of revenues in the quarter. So I thought that was a very interesting line because normally Tesla does not break out its FSD revenues that way. So the fact that they're actually talking about releasing the FSD functionality to Cybertruck means that all of the Cybertrucks that were sold to date historically for Tesla, which is by my estimates around 28,000 units, would have had some of the FSD revenue recognized. Now, the reason for that is that all of the Foundation Series vehicles, which is what was sold through Q3, actually come with FSD attached. So if you do some kind of rough math, I think that contributes around $179 million to the total. So a little bit over roughly half the total balance that they talked about there was just because Cybertruck functionality finally rolled out. But they also released actually Smart Summon and other features to every single vehicle, at least in North America. And so that resulted in a portion of the FSD revenue being recognized as well. If we take a look at their 10Q, which was just put out this morning, let me share that portion since I do have that up on the screen here. You can see what they're saying is this is some new language that was not in previous 10Qs. It says, additionally, we recognize 326 million of FSD revenue for Cybertruck and certain features, such as actually Smart Summon in the third quarter of 2024. So this is new language. They did not have that in there before. And so I think it's very interesting. And it's possible that we can use this information to learn a little bit about what FSD take rate might be. And we've got to definitely take this with a grain of salt, but let me show you what I mean by working through a quick analysis that I just put together this morning. So let me go pull up my earnings model. I just created this new tab here. And essentially what I've done is pulled the automotive deferred revenue balance for the last 4 quarters and the current portion of that balance. So for those of you who maybe aren't as accounting inclined or just need a refresher, the deferred revenue balance is the amount of cash that Tesla has essentially brought in for functionality or features that they have not yet delivered. A lot of this is FSD revenue, but it's also things like free supercharging or premium connectivity. So if you've collected the revenue for that, but you for like a 12 months in the future, but you haven't actually delivered that, that goes into there. So there's all sorts of kind of incentives and other things, but full self-driving is a very significant portion of this. The current portion of that balance is the amount that they expect to recognize in the next 12 months. So as time is ticking along and they're delivering some of that functionality, a portion of it gets recognized, but then also as you have new sales, you get additions back to that deferred revenue balance. So what I'm going to try to do here is take a look at how much was disclosed that was actually recognized in this quarter and to see what we can do to back into some numbers. So what we have here is the spread. So let's take a look just at September 30th. So we know the current portion of the deferred revenue balance at the end of the quarter was $821 million. They noted, as we just saw, that they recognized 326 million of the full self-driving revenue from that balance in Q3. So what I'm trying to do now is to say, okay, how much of that was Cybertruck related? So if we take the 28,000 Cybertruck deliveries that have happened so far cumulatively, and we apply the $8,000 FSD portion of that delivery, and we assume that around 80% of it is recognized because we don't have some functionality like Banish. And additionally, there's ongoing improvements. So even if all the functionality gets delivered, you're not going to recognize 100% of the revenue, even in that case. But I think 80% is probably a reasonable estimate, given the fact that you've got city street driving, you've got highway driving, you've got actually Smart Summon now, and pretty much the vast majority of the functionality has been delivered to date. So if we assume 80%, then that implies $179 million of Cybertruck FSD revenue was recognized this quarter. And so then that leaves $147 million of other FSD revenue. So think of it like existing Model 3Y S and X vehicles that now have actually Smart Summon that was recognized. In order to get this current portion balanced, so you got the $940 million that was the current portion at the end of Q2. we see that dropped to 821 million in Q3. So you had a roughly $120 million decrease in that current portion of the deferred revenue balance. But we know that they recognized 300 and what's the number here? This is a little flying by the seat of my pants. We know they recognized 326 million. So that implies that there was additions to the balance of roughly $207 million. Now, take this with a very big grain of salt, because some of the additions to the current portion could be long-term portions of the balance that are now current. So something that you were expecting to recognize in, let's say, August of 2024. Well, that would have been long-term portion in Q2, and in Q3, it would become current portion just because you're expecting to recognize it then. So there's a little bit of that. There's also some decent amount of noise with other stuff in there, like free supercharging and premium connectivity and all the other automotive deferred revenue stuff that gets in there. But nonetheless, I think looking at how this balance has been historically, it's been roughly the same. And as they did deliver some functionality in Q1, we saw that balance dip and then build back up again, and then dipped again with the recognition that they had so far. So what we're trying to do with this analysis is see how much of the additions to this deferred revenue balance might be related to FSD sales, and what might we be able to possibly infer with a massive grain of salt about what the take rate might be. So if we assume that the kind of noise of the premium connectivity and all the supercharging is like roughly flat, and we assume that this $207 million is all related to full self-driving, well, what might that imply about take rate? So here, let's jump down to what that might show us. So I'm starting with an analysis of what is the estimated percent of full self-driving that is recognized at the time of sale. Now, this is going to be different geography by geography. So in the United States, for example, is probably something like 80 or 90% recognizable upfront. But in Europe, it's going to be a lot lower than that. China also. But we also know that the take rate in those geographies is also a lot lower. So you've got to weight the higher take rate in the US with the fact that that's higher percent recognized and come up with an overall figure. So let's just say right now we want to go a little bit more conservative and say only 60% is recognized at sale. Now, I think this is almost certainly too low. And the reason that we know that is because a couple of years ago, Tesla disclosed that over half of their FSD revenue was recognizable at the time. And this was, I want to say 2021 or something like that, where Zach Kirkhorn on one of their quarterly calls made that comment. And since then, they've delivered a lot more functionality. So it stands to reason that, at least in the US, the amount that's recognizable is probably, I think, closer to 80% or so. Maybe on a global weighted average, it might be closer to 70, but I think somewhere in that kind of 60 to 80% range is a reasonable kind of range of the percent that's recognizable for us to take a look at. We know the price is $8,000, and we know that the Q3 deliveries were just under 463,000. And so now we can just play with some take rates. So if we have an 8% FSD take rate and 60% recognizable, which again, I think is a little bit on the low side, then that tells us that we have cash full self-driving sales of $296 million. And that of these new sales, about $178 million would be recognizable in the current quarter, and $118 million would be added to the deferred revenue balance. So if we take these numbers at face value, then that would essentially imply that around half the difference in the current FSD deferred revenue additions is related to full self-driving. Now, I think that's a little bit low. I think full self-driving is making up the vast majority of the additions to the current portion of the deferred revenue balance, especially since we know they're planning to recognize those in the current period. And then also, if you look at the long-term portion, it's essentially unchanged. It decreased by $50 million in Q3. I think if you want to go conservative, maybe you could say 50 million of the 207 is long-term portion that became current. But what we're trying to do here is just look at some reasonable kind of ranges of values and what might that imply about the take rate. So 8% take rate is where I thought the global average take rate had been on new sales. And keep in mind that this is only take rate on the purchases. It's not on subscriptions. So if we're higher than that, which is kind of what we'd have to be if we want to get the number closer to 207%, that would obviously be very good news. So let's say we get to 12%, for example, which, to be clear, I don't really think we are, but this is just what the math is showing. So if we get to a 12% and all other items equal, then that implies $178 million of FSD additions from the new sales, and with the 60% recognizable upfront, which again, I think the 60% is actually a little bit on the low side. Maybe let's say on a weighted average basis, it's closer to 70%. Again, keeping in mind that there's going to be differences geographically. So at 70%, then that additions balance drops to 133 million. So what we're trying to do is see how can we reasonably get the additions number to match what we know have been the additions to the current portion of the deferred revenue balance. And so a 12% take rate, if this is in fact true, would be like phenomenal news for Tesla, especially considering the fact that we know that FSD take rate increased after the 1010 event. So that we might be looking at something even higher than that. This is, if we want to go even more aggressive and say, okay, well, they delivered actually smart summon. Almost all of the FSD vehicle sales are probably in the United States. And if we know that 3 years ago, they were over 50% and they've delivered all this additional functionality since then, maybe it's more like 80%. So if we go to 80%, then we can see that with the 12% additions, it really suggests that the number is too low to make the additions to the deferred revenue balance actually make sense. So this would be wild news if we were to make the take rate something like 20%. Then in this case, the numbers are closer to tying out. And again, you've got to take this $200 million figure with a grain of salt. So maybe we are trying to get closer to $150 million or so. But it just, the numbers that this is implying are, I think, pretty wild. If I were to go with what I would expect just based on these numbers, maybe it'd be something like a 70% blended average overall percent recognizable. And then I think the, again, blended nationwide or global FSD take rate, I just struggle to really see it as being above 10% just because FSD subscriptions are so cheap right now. But let's just say that it is 10%, then that means that only half essentially of the additions to the deferred revenue balance, the current portion of the deferred revenue balance, are related to FSD, which strikes me as too low. So something about these numbers doesn't quite jibe up. And I think the most promising explanation is that FSD take rate on purchases is higher than we might be thinking. Just to make the math tie out a little bit closer, 12% again is probably a little bit too low. Maybe 14%, we get to $150 million. I could see that being a more reasonable explanation. But if FSD take rate on purchases is actually 14%, that would be absolutely wild. Although one other kind of caveat here is that the 14% might be too high because the existing fleet can also opt to upgrade. So essentially, if you look at the total number of purchases that this would imply, then let's just look at what this number is. That's 65,000 vehicles essentially purchasing FSD within the quarter. Given that we've got a fleet of, I think it's around 5 million or so globally, a good chunk of those are in the United States. Maybe there's, 30,000 existing owners that opted to upgrade this quarter. And then the other 35,000 are people who bought it with the time of vehicle purchase. We are kind of pulling at strings here. Take all of this with a massive caveat. But the thing that really struck me and why I wanted to put this video out is it's hard to make these numbers make sense without FSD take rate being higher than what I thought. So that would be very good news for Tesla indeed. And I do hope that they start to disclose a little bit more about that going forward. So just to conclude, we did have this new language in both the earnings call and in the 10K, in the 10Q, kind of disclosing the amount of FSD revenue that was recognized. I hope they continue to explicitly call that out, and I hope we see more disclosures about this going forward. And most of all, I hope that FSD take rate continues to go up because that's the sort of thing that can really make margins take off. And one side note, just to conclude all this, the take rate was, the margins were almost inexplicably high this quarter. I mean, I think everybody across the board was surprised at how high gross margins were, considering that credits were not like wildly out of proportion. So one reason or one way this might make sense is just if you have higher FSD sales really contributing to that margin. So this is a reasonable thesis to me, something I'm going to continue monitoring. But I just wanted to share my quick thoughts since we do have these new disclosures that went out this morning. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time.